My name is Vivian Ashcroft. I'm 33 years old, and 11 days ago my grandmother stopped answering her phone. This story took me longer to tell than most because it's still fresh, and because some of it is still working its way through a courtroom rather than being fully resolved. But I wanted to share it now, while the details are clear in my mind, because I think there's someone watching this who needs to hear it before their own version of this story reaches day 11. That doesn't sound like the beginning of a dramatic story. People miss calls. Elderly women forget to charge their phones or doze off in the afternoon, or simply don't feel like talking. That's what my family told me over and over, for 11 straight days, every time I called them asking why nobody had actually laid eyes on her. My mother said I was spiraling. My uncle told me, not unkindly, that I'd always had a flair for the dramatic. My own father used the word paranoid, a word he'd used about me more than once before, and one I'd learned a long time ago, meant something closer to correct, in a way that's inconvenient for me. I want you to sit with that word for a second because it's going to matter later. Paranoid. It's such a comfortable word for a family to reach for, isn't it? It doesn't sound cruel the way liar would, or dismissive the way shut up would. It sounds almost clinical, almost caring, like the person saying it is worried about you rather than worried about what you might find. I've come to believe in the years since that paranoid is one of the most effective tools a family can use against the one person in the room who notices things, precisely because it reframes accurate observation as a personal flaw in need of managing, rather than a signal worth investigating. By the time this story ends, I will have spent 72 hours doing something I never trained for and never wanted to do. Building a case alone against the people who share my last name, with a woman's actual safety on the line and a closing window I couldn't slow down no matter how carefully I moved. I've told other stories about family and money before. This one is different. This one had a clock running the entire time, and I didn't know until the very last hour whether I was going to beat it. Before I tell you what I found, if you've ever had a gut feeling everyone around you insisted was overreacting, and it turned out you were the only one paying attention to the right thing, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who's with me on this one because it gets tense, and I promise you it does not go where you expect it to. Let me take you back to where this family, and this particular kind of silence, actually started.
My grandfather, Wallace Ashcroft, opened his first assisted living home in 1979, a converted Victorian house with 14 residents and a philosophy that dignity mattered more than efficiency. By the time I was a teenager, the Ashcroft Senior Living Group had grown into a chain of 18 residential care facilities across 3 states, and my father, Preston Ashcroft, ran it as CEO with my uncle, Neil, serving as Chief Operating Officer. There were 3 of us grandchildren close in age, my cousin Ben, my brother Cole, and me, and from the time we could walk, the family had already sorted us into categories nobody bothered to explain out loud. Cole was groomed. He shadowed my father at regional meetings before he could legally sign anything. Ben, Neil's son, was being trained for facilities management, learning the operational side, the maintenance contracts, the staffing schedules. And me, I was, in the family's internal shorthand, the sensitive one. Not because I cried easily, because I asked questions nobody wanted to answer at Thanksgiving. I remember being 12 years old, visiting my grandfather's original facility with my class for a service project, and noticing that the resident call button response times, which I'd overheard 2 aides discussing anxiously in a hallway, seemed to stretch far longer on weekend night shifts than on weekday shifts. I mentioned it to my father that evening, genuinely curious, the way any child raised around a family business might be. He told me, with a laugh he clearly meant to be gentle, that I had Grandpa's nose for numbers but none of his patience for people, and that maybe I should focus on something a little less morbid, like my homework. I didn't understand, at 12, that the comment wasn't really about my homework. It was the first of many moments where my family quietly filed away my instincts as a personality quirk instead of what they actually were, an early, uncomfortable talent for noticing exactly the kind of thing a well-run senior care company should never want noticed. There's a second memory from around that same era that I think explains the pattern even more clearly. When I was 14, my grandfather, still active in the business then, took me on one of his periodic unannounced facility walkthroughs, something he did quietly, without telling the on-site administrators in advance, because he believed, correctly as it turned out, that scheduled inspections only ever showed you what a facility wanted you to see. I loved those walkthroughs. He'd let me carry his clipboard and check things off a list he'd refined over decades: call light response times, the freshness of food in the dining hall, whether staff greeted residents by name. On one of those visits, I noticed a resident's medication cart left unattended and unlocked in a hallway for several minutes while an aide helped someone in a nearby room. I mentioned it to my grandfather, and he took it seriously, immediately writing it down, following up with the facility director before we left that same afternoon. My father, when he heard about it later that week, laughed it off in front of company, calling it Vivian playing detective again, in a tone that made clear he thought the whole exercise was a charming but ultimately unserious use of a Saturday. My grandfather, notably, didn't laugh along. He just looked at me and said, quietly, "Your father's going to run a bigger company than I ever did, and he's going to need someone around who still notices the unlocked cart. Don't let anyone talk you out of noticing it, Vivian, no matter how they frame it." I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later, sitting in a parking lot outside Meadow Ridge photographing an unmarked investigator's license plate. By then, my grandfather had been gone for years, and the unlocked cart instinct he'd encouraged in me was the only thing standing between my grandmother and whatever my father and uncle were quietly managing without her. In college, I studied accounting and eventually forensic auditing, drawn to the field by something I couldn't fully articulate at the time but understand clearly now: a need to find the place where the official story and the real story stopped matching up, and to do something about the gap. The summer after my junior year, I applied for a highly competitive forensic accounting fellowship at a regional healthcare compliance firm, one of only 15 spots offered nationally that year, specifically focused on financial oversight in long-term care facilities. I got in. I remember calling my mother from my dorm room, genuinely excited, expecting at minimum a moment of shared pride. Instead, there was a long pause on the line followed by, "Honey, are you sure that's a healthy thing to focus on? All that auditing. It sounds like it would make you paranoid about everything." Cole, meanwhile, was spending that same summer as an unpaid operation shadow at one of our family's own facilities, a position my father had personally created for him, with no equivalent ever offered to me despite my degree being, by any objective measure, more directly relevant to the actual business. I took the fellowship anyway. I didn't ask permission that time. I'd learned, by then, that permission in my family was something reserved for plans that fit the story they'd already written about each of us, and mine had never included the words financial investigator. That fellowship changed the direction of my entire life. I spent 10 weeks reviewing financial irregularities across a portfolio of long-term care facilities completely unrelated to my family's company, learning to spot the exact patterns that separate an honest bookkeeping error from a deliberate cover-up: vendor invoices that didn't match delivered supplies, staffing logs padded to satisfy state minimums on paper while real coverage on the floor ran dangerously thin, incident reports quietly reclassified to avoid mandatory reporting thresholds. I didn't know it yet, but I was building the exact skill set I would need, years later, to save my own grandmother's life. I never went to work for Ashcroft Senior Living Group. I took a job instead at a healthcare compliance and forensic audit firm based in Denver, specializing in identifying financial and operational fraud across long-term care networks, the unglamorous, deeply necessary work of protecting vulnerable residents from the kind of quiet negligence that hides behind clean paperwork. My family knew almost nothing real about what I did. At every holiday gathering, I gave them the same vague sentence: "I do compliance work for healthcare companies," and they nodded along, uninterested, the same way they nodded along at every version of my life since that 12-year-old's comment about call button response times. My father once introduced me to a family friend at a Christmas party as our paperwork person, a description so reductive I almost laughed, except that by then I'd learned there wasn't much point correcting him. He wasn't going to remember the correction past the end of the conversation anyway. By 2023, I'd spent 7 years building a reputation in my field that had nothing to do with my last name. I'd led investigations that resulted in state licensing actions against 3 separate care home operators for falsified staffing records. I'd testified, twice, in front of a state regulatory board about vendor billing fraud patterns in long-term care. None of that ever came up at Thanksgiving. My family had already decided a long time ago exactly how big a role I was allowed to play in anything that mattered, and my actual expertise simply didn't fit the shape of the box they'd built for me. One of those investigations, the second licensing action I led, involved a facility in rural Colorado where administrators had been quietly reclassifying serious falls as assisted transfers in resident charts to avoid state mandatory reporting thresholds, a pattern that took me nearly 4 months to fully document, cross-referencing incident timestamps against staffing logs and emergency room admission records from the nearest hospital. I remember finishing that case and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, a kind of professional pride that had nothing to do with anyone in my family noticing it. Nobody at Ashcroft Senior Living Group ever asked me about that case, or any of the others. I'd stopped expecting them to by then. It was, in its own way, freeing. I'd built an entire professional identity in a field my family considered a strange hobby, and none of them had any idea how good at it I'd actually become. I want to be honest that I didn't think about my family's own facilities very often during those years. I'd made a conscious choice, early in my career, never to review or request access to anything connected to Ashcroft Senior Living Group, the same way a judge recuses from a case involving family. It felt like the only clean way to keep the two parts of my life separate, the sister and granddaughter who showed up to holidays and got called paranoid, and the investigator who'd built an actual career finding exactly the kind of thing my family would never want found in their own hallways. That boundary held for 7 years. It broke 11 days ago. If you've ever built real expertise in something your family dismissed as a quirky hobby, tell me about it in the comments. Stay with me, though, because the next part is where this stops being a story about being underestimated and starts being a story about a closing window and a woman I love running out of time. My grandmother, Margaret Ashcroft, is 84 years old. 4 years ago, after my grandfather passed, she moved into Meadow Ridge, the flagship Ashcroft Senior Living facility, the same one my grandfather had personally designed the common areas for decades earlier. It was supposed to be the safest place in the world for her, her late husband's legacy, her son and grandson running the company that owned it, her family, in theory, watching over every detail. Margaret and I talked every Sunday evening without fail for 4 years. Not out of obligation. She was the one person in that family who had never once called me paranoid, never once dismissed a question I asked, and I'd found, somewhere in my late 20s, that our Sunday calls had become the thing I looked forward to most in any given week. 11 days ago, she didn't answer. I assumed, at first, that she'd simply lost track of time, the way she occasionally did. I called again the next day. No answer. By the third day, I called the facility directly and was told, politely but vaguely, that she was resting comfortably and that visiting hours had been temporarily adjusted due to a facility-wide flu precaution. That explanation held up for about 4 more days, until I called my father directly and asked him to simply walk down the hall and check on her himself. "She's fine, Vivian," he said, in the tone he'd used my entire life for conversations he wanted to end quickly. "The facility has protocols. You don't need to make this into something." "I'm not making it into anything, Dad. I'm asking you to look at your own mother. I've been in touch with the administrator. Everything's under control. You always do this. You take one small thing and turn it into a 5-alarm fire." By day 9, my Uncle Neil called me, unprompted, which should have told me something on its own, since Neil rarely called me about anything. He was oddly formal, reading almost from a script. "Margaret's doing well, Vivian. The facility felt it was best to limit outside visits during this transition period while they finish some infrastructure upgrades in her wing. We'll let you know the moment restrictions lift." Transition period. Infrastructure upgrades. I'd spent 7 years reading exactly this kind of language in incident reports and compliance filings, and I knew, immediately, viscerally, that I was hearing the vocabulary of a cover-up, not an inconvenience. Nobody in my family used phrases like transition period casually. Someone had coached that sentence. That was the moment the two halves of my life, the granddaughter who got dismissed and the investigator who'd spent 7 years learning to hear exactly this kind of language, collided completely. I want to walk you through what I actually did next because this isn't a story about a gut feeling that happened to be right. It's a story about methodology, about exactly how you build a case in 72 hours when the people stonewalling you also happen to be your own family and you can't afford to tip your hand before you have enough to act on. Hour 1 through 6 asterisk, I pulled every publicly available state licensing record for Meadow Ridge going back 3 years. State long-term care regulators require facilities to report certain incidents, falls, medication errors, unexplained injuries, within specific windows, and those filings are, in most states, part of the public record if you know where to look and how to request them. I found 2 filed incident reports for Meadow Ridge in the past 18 months, both minor, both resolved quickly. For a 140-bed facility, that number should have made me feel better. Instead, it made my stomach drop, because in my professional experience, a facility that size reporting almost nothing over 18 months is far more often a sign of underreporting than of an unusually safe environment. Hour 6 through 18 asterisk, I called a former colleague, Dana Whitlock, who now worked as an ombudsman investigator for the state's long-term care oversight office, a position specifically designed to advocate for residents independent of facility management. I didn't tell her my grandmother was involved, not yet. I framed it as a professional consultation, asked her what it would take to trigger an unannounced welfare check on a specific resident whose family had been unable to make contact for over a week. She told me, honestly, that with a documented pattern of restricted access and vague administrative language, she could likely get a case worker out within 48 to 72 hours, but that the facility would almost certainly be tipped off in advance by internal notification protocols, giving them time to prepare a room, prepare an explanation, prepare Margaret herself for a conversation. If there was something real happening, a scheduled welfare check alone might not surface it. Dana and I had worked together on 2 prior cases years earlier, and she was one of the only people in my professional life who knew, in general terms, that my family owned a chain of senior living facilities. She didn't ask why I was suddenly asking hypothetical questions about a resident I wouldn't name. She simply answered them, professionally, the way she would for any investigator calling with a legitimate concern. It wasn't until nearly 2 hours into that call, after I'd asked a specific enough follow-up question about financial power of attorney red flags, that she said, quietly, "Vivian, is this about your grandmother?" I remember sitting in my car outside a gas station on the interstate, gripping the steering wheel, and simply saying yes. She didn't say anything dramatic in response. She just said, "Okay. Then let's do this properly and fast." And from that point on, the conversation stopped being hypothetical. That was the moment I understood I couldn't just call in the cavalry and wait. If something was actually wrong, I needed evidence that existed before anyone had a chance to sanitize it. Hour 18 through 30 asterisk, I drove 7 hours through the night to the small city where Meadow Ridge was located, telling no one in my family I was coming. I checked into a motel 2 miles from the facility under my own name because I wasn't doing anything illegal, just careful. I spent that night reviewing every piece of correspondence I'd received from the facility over the past 4 years. Routine care updates, billing statements, the occasional newsletter, looking for staff names, administrator titles, anything that might help me understand who actually controlled information flow inside that building. Hour 30 through 42 asterisk, the next morning, I did something I want to be honest about because I think it matters for understanding exactly how careful you have to be in a situation like this. I didn't storm the front desk demanding to see my grandmother. If something was actually being concealed, a visible, emotional confrontation from a family member would only accelerate whatever cleanup was already underway. Instead, I called the facility's main line, gave my name honestly, and asked to schedule a standard family care conference meeting with the administrator, the kind any family member is entitled to request. I framed it as a routine check-in, nothing urgent, available whenever convenient in the next few days. This bought me something valuable, a scheduled window during which the facility would have no particular reason to suspect I already believed something was wrong, and during which I could observe the building itself without raising alarms. While I waited for that meeting to be scheduled, I parked, entirely legally, in the facility's public visitor lot and watched the building for several hours across 2 separate shifts, noting staff arrival and departure patterns, delivery schedules, and something that caught my attention immediately, a private security vehicle, unmarked except for a small magnetic company logo, that arrived twice during my observation window and parked near a service entrance rather than the main entrance, staying for roughly 90 minutes each time. I want to describe what those hours in the parking lot actually felt like, because I think people imagine surveillance as something tense and cinematic, and mostly it's the opposite. Long stretches of nothing, punctuated by small details that mean everything once you know how to read them. I ate a granola bar I'd bought at a gas station 2 states ago. I refilled a notebook with timestamps and vehicle descriptions in handwriting that got progressively less steady as the hours wore on, and the reality of what I might be documenting settled in more fully. At one point, a facilities maintenance truck pulled up to the same service entrance, and 2 men unloaded what appeared to be several boxes of paper files rather than any physical equipment, carrying them inside and returning 20 minutes later with the truck bed empty. I photographed that too, not entirely sure yet what it meant, only certain that a maintenance truck moving paper records rather than tools was exactly the kind of detail that belonged in a case file rather than dismissed as irrelevant. I photographed the unmarked vehicle's plate, entirely from public property, and ran it that evening through a database I still had limited professional access to from my compliance work. It came back registered to a private investigations firm, not a security company, an investigations firm, with a listed client history that included, buried 3 pages into a public business filing, a prior contract with Ashcroft Senior Living Group's corporate office. My family, I now understood, wasn't just managing an awkward situation with vague language. They had hired outside investigators to manage something at that facility, and whatever it was serious enough to warrant discretion rather than an internal fix. If your pulse just picked up reading that, mine did too, sitting in that parking lot. Stay with me, because the next part is where I finally got inside that building. My family conference meeting was scheduled for the following morning, 48 hours after Margaret's silence had started to feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. The administrator, a composed woman named Ellen Ferris, who I'd never met in person before, greeted me warmly in the lobby, and I let her believe, for the first 10 minutes of our meeting, that I was exactly the mildly concerned granddaughter she expected. Her office was decorated the way I imagine every facility administrator's office is decorated, deliberately, to reassure worried families. Soft-framed photographs of smiling residents at holiday events, a shelf of thank you cards displayed at an angle that made sure visitors would notice them, a small dish of hard candies positioned exactly within arm's reach of the visitor chair. I'd seen offices arranged this way before, in prior investigations, and I'd learned that the amount of visible reassurance in a room often runs in the opposite direction of how reassuring the actual situation is. I asked routine questions first. How was Margaret adjusting to the season change? Had her appetite been steady? Standard, harmless, the kind of questions that let me watch her body language rather than her words. Ellen answered smoothly, confidently, until I asked, casually, whether I could simply walk down and say hello after our meeting, since I'd driven quite a distance. The pause before her answer was less than 2 seconds long. To most people, it would have meant nothing. To someone trained to notice the exact moment a rehearsed script runs out of prepared lines, it meant everything. Of course, she said, recovering smoothly. Though I should mention, her wing has had some ongoing maintenance work this week, so we may need to visit in the family lounge instead of her room. That's fine, I said. I'd actually love to see her room too, if that's possible. I sent her a care package last month, and I want to make sure it arrived. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Let me check with the floor staff, she said, and left the room for what she framed as a 2-minute errand and turned into nearly 15. I used those 15 minutes exactly the way 7 years of training had taught me to. I didn't wander the halls, which would have looked exactly as suspicious as it was. I sat quietly in the family lounge and reviewed on my phone the specific state regulation governing mandatory family access to resident rooms during standard visiting hours. A regulation Meadow Ridge, as a licensed facility, was legally required to comply with barring a documented, currently active health quarantine, which nothing in my prior calls had actually confirmed existed at a facility level, only vague references to precautions. When Ellen returned, she told me Margaret was having a difficult morning and might prefer a shorter visit. I told her, calmly, that I understood completely, and that a short visit was fine. I simply needed to see her myself. Today, given the difficulty we'd had reaching her by phone for the past 11 days. I mentioned, just as calmly, that I was aware of the specific state access regulation covering situations exactly like this one, and that I was prepared to contact the Ombudsman's office that same afternoon if there was any further difficulty arranging a visit. Something in her posture changed the moment I said the word ombudsman. It was subtle, but I'd spent 7 years learning to read exactly that shift. The moment a facility representative recalculates whether stonewalling is still the safer option. Margaret was in her room 20 minutes later. And when I saw her, I understood, immediately, why my family had spent 11 days keeping everyone away. She was thinner than she should have been, noticeably so, even accounting for a woman in her 80s. There was a fading bruise along her forearm she couldn't clearly explain, describing it only as from getting up too fast one night. Her water pitcher, when I checked it, was nearly empty and appeared not to have been refilled that day despite it being early afternoon. Most alarming to me, professionally, was a small adhesive bandage on the inside of her opposite arm, in a location and pattern I recognized immediately from prior fraud investigations, consistent with recent, repeated blood draws that had no corresponding entry in the visible portion of her bedside care chart. I asked her, as gently as I could, whether anyone had explained to her why she hadn't been able to make or receive phone calls for over a week. She told me, quietly, that she'd been told the facility phone lines were being upgraded and that a woman she didn't recognize had visited her twice that week asking questions about her will and her financial accounts, questions Margaret said made her uncomfortable enough that she'd stopped answering them. She said the strangeness of it had unsettled her more than she let on to the staff, enough that she'd started, quietly, writing down dates and small details in the back pages of a crossword puzzle book she kept by her bed, just in case, she said. Someone eventually asked. I sat with that for a moment, the image of my 84-year-old grandmother keeping her own quiet record in the back of a crossword book, the same instinct my grandfather had once encouraged in me showing up, unprompted, in her too. It occurred to me then that perhaps that instinct hadn't skipped a generation after all. It had simply been waiting in both of us for the moment it would matter most. She told me more once I sat with her a while longer, and she seemed to relax slightly, reassured by the fact that I wasn't rushing her or pressing too hard. She said the woman who'd visited about her had brought papers already printed, already filled in with names and dates, and had seemed frustrated, in a controlled way, when Margaret said she wanted to think about it and talk to her own attorney first, the one who'd handled my grandfather's estate for decades. She told me there wasn't really time for that, Margaret said, her voice thin but clear. She said the paperwork needed to be finished this week. I didn't like how that sounded, Vivian, so I just kept saying I needed to think about it, over and over until she stopped coming. I asked her whether she'd told anyone else on staff about the visits, and she said she had once, mentioning it in passing to an aide she trusted, a young woman named Priya, who'd worked her wing for over a year. Margaret said Priya's face had changed at the mention of it, gone carefully blank in a way Margaret, in her decades of reading people, had learned to recognize as fear rather than indifference. Priya hadn't said anything further, only patted her hand and moved on to the next task, but Margaret said she'd noticed and hadn't brought it up with staff again after that. It was a small detail, but it told me something important, that at least one person inside that building had likely known enough to be frightened and had said nothing, not out of complicity, but because the same isolation being used against Margaret was very possibly being used, in a different form, against the staff, who might otherwise have spoken up. I later learned, once the broader investigation moved forward, that this same aide had in fact been quietly documenting her own concerns for weeks in a personal notebook she kept at home, too afraid of losing her job to report anything formally, but unwilling to let it go entirely either. When state investigators eventually interviewed her, she handed over that notebook voluntarily, and it corroborated the staffing gap timeline almost exactly. I never got to thank her directly. Facility staff were understandably kept separate from family members during the active investigation, but I think about her often, another quiet observer in this story who noticed what she wasn't supposed to notice, and held on to it anyway, waiting for the moment it might finally matter. I felt something settle into place hearing that, A mixture of relief that her instincts had protected her and fury that she'd had to rely on nothing but her own quiet refusal, alone in a room, with no one checking in to make sure that refusal held. "You did exactly the right thing, Grandma," I told her. "I need you to keep doing exactly that if anyone asks you to sign anything again before I've had a chance to look at it first." I want to describe what that moment felt like, sitting on the edge of Margaret's bed. 7 years of professional training, all the careful methodology, all the parking lot surveillance and license plate lookups. None of it prepared me for sitting on the edge of my grandmother's bed, holding her thin hand, hearing her describe a stranger asking about her while the facility that was supposed to protect her kept her isolated from the one person who might have noticed something was wrong. This wasn't an abstract compliance case anymore. This was Margaret. And I had, by my own estimate, no more than a day or two before whatever was happening reached a point I might not be able to reverse. I remember, specifically, the exact moment my professional composure nearly broke. It was when Margaret, apologetically, almost embarrassed, asked me if she'd done something wrong by refusing to sign the papers. "I didn't want to make trouble," she said. "I just didn't like the feeling of it." I had to excuse myself briefly, step into the hallway, and take several long breaths before I trusted myself to walk back into that room with a steady voice. 84 years old, and she was apologizing to me for protecting herself. That single sentence, more than anything in the state's eventual investigative report, is the thing I think about most when I try to explain why those 72 hours mattered as much as they did. I left Meadow Ridge that afternoon without confronting Ellen Ferris directly, which was, I still believe, the correct call, even though every instinct in me wanted to demand answers on the spot. A confrontation without leverage would only have accelerated whatever cleanup was already underway. Instead, I did 3 things within the next 6 hours, moving faster than I'd ever moved in my professional life. First, I called Dana Whitlock back and told her the truth this time, that the resident in question was my own grandmother, that I'd personally observed signs consistent with medical neglect and possible financial exploitation, and that I had reason to believe outside investigators hired by facility ownership were actively managing the situation rather than addressing it. Dana didn't hesitate. She told me she could get an emergency welfare check authorized within 24 hours given the specifics I described, and that my documented observations, the bruising, the dehydration signs, the unexplained blood draw markers, the reported stranger asking about financial accounts, met the threshold for an expedited case rather than a routine one. Second, I contacted an elder law attorney, a woman named Priscilla Hale who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, and retained her that same evening to file an emergency petition for temporary guardianship review, specifically to establish an independent check on any financial or medical decisions being made on Margaret's behalf until the welfare check could be completed. I want to be honest that this step terrified me more than any of the others, because it meant formally, legally, putting myself in direct opposition to my own father and uncle, the 2 men who currently held whatever informal authority existed over Margaret's day-to-day care as facility owners and family. There was no one doing that step once it was filed. Third, and this was the hardest call I made that day, I phoned my father directly, not to warn him, but because I needed, for my own conscience, to give him one honest chance to tell me the truth before the legal process took over. "Dad," I said, "I saw Grandma today. I saw the bruising. I saw that she hasn't had access to a working phone in 11 days. I know a private investigations firm with a prior contract with the company visited that facility twice this week. I need you to tell me, right now, honestly, what is happening." The silence on the line lasted long enough that I knew, before he said a single word, that whatever came next wasn't going to be an honest answer. "Vivian, you're overreacting. There's a financial matter involving the facility's operating accounts that Neil and I are handling internally. It has nothing to do with Margaret's care, and involving lawyers is only going to make things messier and more public than they need to be. A stranger asked her about her will, Dad. Twice." Another pause. That would have been someone from our own compliance team, doing a routine review. "This is exactly why we didn't want to worry you with the details." "You didn't want to worry me, or you didn't want me looking closely at something you knew I'd recognize the second I saw it?" He didn't answer that question. He didn't need to. I already had my answer, and by that point, So did Dana Whitlock's office, and so did Priscilla Hale's emergency filing. The state's emergency welfare check happened the following morning, conducted jointly by an ombudsman caseworker and a state long-term care licensing investigator, arriving unannounced specifically because of the pattern I documented. I wasn't in the room for that visit, by design. Priscilla advised strongly against my presence, since any appearance of me directing or influencing the state's independent findings could compromise the case's legal standing later. I spent that morning in a motel room I'd started to know far too well, waiting for a phone call, more anxious than I'd been in years of reviewing other people's fraud cases from a comfortable professional distance. I remember, specifically, the drive back to Denver once everything had finally settled enough for me to leave. 7 hours. The same stretch of highway I'd driven through the night 11 days earlier with nothing but a duffel bag and a growing sense of dread. This time the drive felt different, not lighter exactly, but steadier, the way a room feels once you've finally turned all the lights on and confirmed there was nothing in the corners after all, only the difficult, necessary work of dealing with what you found there instead. I stopped once, about halfway home, at a rest area overlooking a stretch of open plains, and I called Margaret just to hear her voice. Not for any particular reason, just because I could, because for the first time in nearly 2 weeks a phone call to her wasn't a small act of quiet desperation. She sounded tired but clear, asked me if I'd eaten anything besides gas station coffee in the past 3 days, and told me, in the same gently scolding tone she'd used my entire life, that I needed to take better care of myself even while taking care of everyone else. I laughed, for what felt like the first time in a week, standing alone at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, and told her I'd work on it. I don't think either of us fully believed me, but it felt, in that moment, like something close enough to normal to hold on to. What the investigation found, over the following days, was worse than I'd let myself fully imagine, and also, in its own way, less dramatic than a television thriller, which is, I've since learned, how most real financial exploitation of the elderly actually looks. It isn't cinematic. It's boring, procedural, and devastating precisely because of how ordinary it appears on paper. Meadow Ridge's operating accounts, it turned out, had been running a significant, sustained deficit for nearly 2 years, a deficit my father and uncle had been quietly covering by redirecting resident trust fund interest payments. Money legally belonging to residents like Margaret held in individual accounts specifically to cover their personal expenses, into the facility's general operating fund, a practice that is not simply a compliance violation but, depending on documentation, can constitute fraud. Margaret's own trust account, one of the largest in the facility given my grandfather's estate planning, had been drawn down substantially over 18 months, with withdrawal authorizations that, on close inspection, bore a signature inconsistent with samples of her actual signature from years prior. The investigators later explained to Priscilla, who relayed it to me in more detail than I initially wanted to hear, that this kind of trust fund redirection is a documented pattern across the long-term care industry nationally, one regulators specifically train investigators to look for precisely because it's so easy to disguise inside routine-looking account transfers. In Meadow Ridge's case, the redirected interest payments had been logged internally under a generic ledger code typically used for facility maintenance reserves, a classification that would have looked entirely unremarkable to anyone not specifically searching for exactly that kind of misdirection. I only recognized the pattern myself because I'd seen a nearly identical ledger code trick used to disguise fraud in an unrelated Colorado facility 2 years earlier, one of the cases that had never once come up at a single family dinner. The stranger, asking about her will, was, in fact, an outside notary my father and uncle had hired, attempting, according to the notary's own statement once investigators interviewed her, to have Margaret execute an updated financial power of attorney naming my Uncle Neil as sole agent, a document Margaret, by her own account and consistent with the notary's report, had refused to sign both times she was approached, precisely because the questions being asked made her uncomfortable enough to stop engaging. The 11 days of restricted phone access weren't a maintenance issue at all. Internal facility communications, later obtained through the state's investigative subpoena power, showed an instruction from corporate leadership to limit outside contact during the transition period, the same phrase Neil had used with me almost word for word, specifically until the power of attorney matter could be resolved. In plain terms, my family had cut off my grandmother's ability to reach the outside world for the specific purpose of pressuring her into signing away financial control before anyone could intervene. Reading those internal communications later, once Priscilla was able to share redacted portions with me as part of preparing for the civil restitution hearing, was one of the harder moments of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the confrontation with my father had been. Seeing the actual phrase "limit outside contact" typed out in a company email, sent from an address I recognized, made something that had felt abstract and procedural suddenly feel entirely, coldly deliberate. It wasn't panic or poor judgment under financial pressure. It was a plan, written down, executed in careful stages, aimed specifically at isolating an 84-year-old woman from her own family long enough to get a signature nobody who loved her would have allowed if they'd known what was actually happening. The bruising and dehydration were, according to the medical review conducted as part of the welfare check, consistent with the documented pattern of reduced staffing on Margaret's specific wing over the preceding month, a wing where, investigators found, 2 aide positions had gone unfilled for 6 weeks despite state minimum staffing requirements. Precisely the kind of gap I'd learned to recognize from 3 years of professional investigations into facilities that were nothing to do with my own family. Once the state's findings were preliminarily confirmed, Priscilla's emergency guardianship petition moved quickly. A judge granted a temporary independent conservator to oversee Margaret's financial affairs pending a full hearing, effectively freezing my father and uncle's ability to access or direct her accounts. I was not named conservator myself. The court appointed a neutral, court-approved fiduciary specifically to avoid any appearance of family conflict of interest, which I fully supported, since my only goal had ever been Margaret's safety, not control over her finances. My father requested to meet with me 4 days after the welfare check, at a diner roughly halfway between our two cities, a location I chose deliberately, neutral, public, nothing like the conference rooms and family dinners where he'd always held the advantage of home ground. He looked older than I remembered, the confident CEO posture entirely absent. "You could have come to me first," he said. "Instead, you went straight to the state. You went straight to lawyers. About your own family." "I did come to you first, Dad. I called you and asked you directly what was happening, and you told me it was a routine compliance review. I gave you exactly one honest chance to tell me the truth, and you used it to lie to me about a stranger pressuring your own mother to sign away her money. It wasn't going to come to that. We had it under control. You had 11 days of silence and a fraudulent power of attorney attempt under control, Dad. 2 aide positions sitting empty for 6 weeks on her own wing. A trust account nearly drained. I've spent 7 years investigating exactly this pattern in other people's facilities. I know precisely what under control looks like when it's actually true, and this wasn't it." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly. "Neil made the financial calls. The operating deficit was real, Vivian. The company was going to lose 2 facilities if we didn't cover the shortfall somehow. He said moving the trust interest was temporary, that we'd pay it back once cash flow improved. That's not a business decision, Dad. That's stealing from vulnerable people to protect a balance sheet and dressing it up in language that made it sound like an internal financial strategy instead of what it actually was." "I didn't know about the notary situation until after it had already happened," he said quietly. "I want you to believe that much, at least." "I believe you didn't personally arrange it," I said. "I don't believe you didn't know something serious enough was happening that you felt the need to tell me it was a routine review instead of the truth. Those are 2 different kinds of guilty, Dad, and I'm not interested in sorting out which one lets you sleep better at night." He was quiet for a while after that, stirring a coffee he hadn't touched since we sat down. "Your grandfather used to say something about you," he said eventually. "That you had the one instinct in this family he trusted more than his own. I used to think he meant it as a compliment about your attention to detail. Sitting here now, I think he meant something closer to a warning aimed at the rest of us. He told me once not to let anyone talk me out of noticing the unlocked cart," I said. I don't think either of us understood, back then, exactly what he was preparing me for. My father looked down at his coffee for a long moment. "I don't have a good answer for you, Vivian. I let Neil handle the financial side because it was easier not to ask too many questions, and I told myself that made me less responsible somehow. I know now it doesn't. I want to tell you honestly what the weeks since have actually looked like, because it wasn't the clean, satisfying ending you might expect from a story with this much tension in it. The state licensing board opened a formal investigation into Ashcroft Senior Living Group's staffing and financial practices across all 18 facilities, not just Meadow Ridge, a process that is, as of this recording, still ongoing and likely to result in significant penalties and mandated corrective action, regardless of how it concludes. My Uncle Neil resigned as chief operating officer under pressure from the company's board and outside legal counsel, though no criminal charges have been filed as of yet. The case, according to Priscilla, is more likely to resolve through civil restitution and a consent agreement with state regulators than through a courtroom. I learned, a few weeks into the broader investigation, that Meadow Ridge wasn't the only facility where similar patterns had emerged once state investigators started looking closely. 2 other Ashcroft-owned facilities showed comparable staffing gaps on specific wings, and one, a smaller home 2 states away, had its own trust account irregularities flagged during the same review, involving a different set of residents entirely. It was a strange, unsettling thing to realize that the 72 hours I'd spent fighting for my own grandmother had, almost as a byproduct, opened a door that ended up protecting people I'd never met and never would, simply because the same warning signs I'd learned to recognize from an unrelated Colorado case turned out to apply just as precisely inside my own family's company. Margaret's trust account is being restored through a court-supervised restitution plan, and the independent conservator appointed by the court continues to oversee her finances, an arrangement Margaret herself, once she understood the full situation, said she was relieved to have in place. She moved, at her own request and with my help, to a different facility entirely, unaffiliated with our family, in a small town 20 minutes from where I now rent an apartment. Our Sunday calls have become Sunday visits instead, and I've learned, in the past few weeks, more about my grandfather's original vision for elder care than I ever absorbed growing up surrounded by a business that apparently stopped honoring it somewhere along the way. The new facility, a smaller, independently owned home run by a former hospice nurse named Corinne, has a policy Margaret mentioned to me approvingly during our first visit there. Every resident's family receives a direct, unlisted line to the on-call nursing supervisor, specifically so that no family member is ever more than one phone call away from an honest, immediate answer about a loved one's condition. Margaret told me she asked Corinne, half joking, half not, whether that policy existed because of situations exactly like the one she'd just left. Corinne, apparently, didn't laugh at the question. She just said, quietly, "It exists because families deserve the truth faster than they usually get it." And Margaret said that was the moment she felt, for the first time in over a month, like she could finally exhale. My relationship with my father remains difficult, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy story. We speak occasionally, carefully, mostly about logistics related to the ongoing investigation. I don't know whether that relationship rebuilds into something warmer over time. I've stopped needing it to in the way I once did. My relationship with Cole, my brother, has actually grown closer through this. He wasn't involved in any of the financial decisions and has been, by every account I've been able to verify, genuinely horrified by what the investigation uncovered. We talk most weeks now, something that wasn't true a year ago. Cole called me the week after the state investigation became public within the company, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from him before. "I feel like I should have known," he said. "I was in every one of those operations meetings. I should have asked more questions." I told him what I've come to believe myself in the weeks since all of this started, that the whole point of a well-hidden cover-up is that it's built specifically so that reasonable, attentive people in the room don't notice it, and that the failure wasn't his for trusting the people running the meetings. The failure belonged entirely to the people who chose to build something worth hiding in the first place. He's asked me, more than once since then, to teach him some of what I actually do for a living, an offer I don't think either of us could have imagined him making a year ago. I said yes. It felt like the first genuinely new thing to grow out of this entire ordeal. I've thought a great deal, in the weeks since that 72-hour stretch, about what this story is actually about, because it would be easy to frame it as a straightforward thriller, The underestimated forensic investigator uncovers her family's crime and brings them to justice. That's not quite the whole truth, and it's not the version I want to leave you with. Here's what I actually learned. Being dismissed as paranoid, as dramatic, as too sensitive to be trusted with anything that mattered, that label followed me for over 2 decades, and for most of that time, it genuinely hurt. What I understand now is that the specific quality my family found so inconvenient about me, my instinct to notice when something didn't add up and refuse to let it go, was never a flaw that needed correcting. It was the exact skill that ended up saving my grandmother's life, and I only had it because nobody ever managed to talk me out of trusting it, no matter how many times they tried. I also learned something about the difference between moving fast and moving recklessly, especially when the people you're moving against are your own family, and the person you're protecting is someone you love more than almost anyone else alive. Every decision I made in those 72 hours, the scheduled meeting instead of a confrontation, the parking lot observation instead of a demand to search the building, the phone call to my father before the legal filing instead of after, was designed specifically to protect Margaret first and hold my family accountable second. In that order, every single time. I think that discipline is the only reason the story ended with her safe instead of with evidence quietly disappearing before anyone outside the family ever saw it. I've thought, too, about what would have happened if I hadn't had 7 years of professional training behind me when that 11th day of silence arrived. I don't think every person facing a version of this has access to a forensic audit background, or a colleague who works for a state ombudsman's office, or an attorney who specializes in exactly the right kind of emergency filing. What I'd want anyone in a similar position to know is that you don't need my specific resume to trust the same underlying instinct. You need to notice when an explanation feels rehearsed instead of true, when a pause before an answer runs half a second longer than it should, when the people around you seem to be working unusually hard to convince you there's nothing to see. Most people, most of the time, aren't investigators. But most people, most of the time, already know the difference between being reassured and being managed. Trust that difference. It's usually right. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. If your gut is telling you something doesn't add up, and the people around you are working hard to convince you it's nothing, pay attention to how hard they're working. Real nothing doesn't usually require that much managing. And if you've spent years being told you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too paranoid to be trusted with the details that matter, I want you to consider the possibility that the people saying it were never actually worried about your judgment. They were worried about what your judgment might eventually notice. I think about him often these days. About that clipboard he handed a 14-year-old on a Saturday morning, and about the unlocked medication cart neither of us forgot. I understand now that noticing things nobody wants noticed isn't a flaw to be managed out of a person. It's a form of care, quiet and unglamorous, that only shows its full value the one time it actually matters most. I want to close this one out properly because it deserves more than a quick sign-off after everything we just walked through together. She said that in her years handling elder protection cases, the ones that end well almost never end well because of a single dramatic confrontation. They end well because someone, usually one person, refused to accept a vague explanation past the point where it stopped making sense and kept refusing, quietly and persistently, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. I didn't do anything superhuman in those 72 hours. I just refused to stop asking the second question. It turns out that's sometimes all it takes, and I hope, wherever you are watching this from, you find the same quiet stubbornness in yourself the next time something doesn't quite add up. I asked Dana Whitlock, weeks later, over coffee back in Denver, whether she thought I'd moved too cautiously in those first hours, whether a faster, louder approach might have gotten Margaret help even sooner. She shook her head. The cautious version is the one that held up in court, she said. The loud version might have felt better for about a day, and then it would have given them time to move the money, coach Margaret through a scripted phone call, clean up exactly the evidence that ended up proving everything. I've held on to that conversation since because I think it captures something important about protecting someone you love when the threat isn't a single dramatic moment, but a slow, deliberate erosion. Patience in that kind of fight isn't the opposite of urgency. It's what makes urgency actually work. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, If it reminded you of your own instincts being dismissed by people who should have listened, leave a comment and let me know. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and check the description for another story I think you'll connect with just as much. One last thing before I let you go. If you've ever sat across from someone insisting, calmly and reasonably, that there's nothing to worry about, while every instinct in you says otherwise, trust the instinct. Ask the second question. Request the room instead of the lounge. The people who are actually fine with scrutiny rarely mind you asking for it, and the people who aren't will tell you everything you need to know in the half-second pause before they answer. Until next time, this is Vivian, and I'm finally the one who got there in time. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there, and trust the instinct telling you something's off.